Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to This Clinical Life, proudly presented by Practicing Excellence. My name is Marla Weston. I'm going to be your guest host today, and I am joined by my colleague, Leslie Kelly. So Leslie, I'm really excited to have you here. The title of our webinar today is Shaping the Future of Nursing, Leveraging Research to Maximize Nurse Leader Impact. And I love the fact that we are focused on the future of nursing, because we know we've had a lot of challenges, and really framing this conversation about what's next and how do we design the kind of future that we want to have is really the focus of this conversation. For those of you who don't know Leslie, I'm particularly excited to have her here because she's got 2 decades worth of clinical research practice under her belt, and has really focused on research related to creating a work environment that supports the professional practice of nurses and an environment that supports nurse leadership. As a matter of fact, she just was awarded recognition by the American Organization of Nurse Leadership for her work in research. So Leslie, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
I'd like to start by talking a little bit about your interest and your focus in nursing research. I have known about your work now for 2 decades, but if you could share a little bit with the audience about what got you interested in this and kind of summarize your work for us.
Sure. I mean, I don't think nursing research is everybody's calling and passion. So when people think about the future in nursing, it might not be nursing research that comes to mind. But when I went to nursing school, we all go into nursing school thinking we might specialize in one field or have a passion for something. And I was just talking to a group of new graduates at my alma mater at U of A and telling them I really thought I was going into pediatrics. It's interesting how we think, we want to do one thing, and nursing school is that wonderful opportunity to explore areas and learn about what we want to do, and then find out it's actually not what we want to do. But one of the things that I learned when I was in nursing school is that my mind was not built for that one-on-one patient interaction. I really kind of had my mind up at a higher level, and I was focusing on processes. My husband said if I was an engineer, I'd be an industrial engineer, because that's how I think, how things work, how things function, how to improve efficiency. And turns out there's an arm of that in nursing where we do that from a research perspective. It's called health services research, and improving the efficiency of healthcare to make patients' outcomes better. And I learned about that when I was in school from actually people like Dr. Marla Weston and my mother, who was going through a PhD program at the time. And so at my university, I learned about this graduate program and the opportunity to get a higher education and improve healthcare from a different type of perspective. We're also fortunate to be able to impact patients' lives and healthcare in a different way. And this was just a unique opportunity to do that. So when we take the chance to do research and say, how can we make something better? Whether it's a clinical trial and we're looking at, drug A compared to drug B, or we're looking at processes and how can we make care more efficient, or we're looking at our actual clinicians, our nurses, and how can we make the work that they do better so that they can improve the care of patients and the outcomes for patients. And that was really what sparked my interest. I have a lot of family members in healthcare. I've grown up around healthcare, and I really saw that, we've struggled in healthcare and we've had a hard time, and it's been slow to improve. And so this was an area for me to work at a systems level, looking at the big picture and doing it from a research perspective.
Well, Leslie, you mentioned that your focus really has been on clinicians themselves, on nurses, and how do we make the lives of nurses better? How do we make their practice better? How do we make it easier and more efficient for them? Understanding this direct line of sight, that when we get that right, when clinicians come to work and they're able to bring their whole selves and the joy that they always imagined in their practice to their work, that translates to everything that we want to have in patient care, right? And so how did you, at a very early age, begin to understand that connection? And what have you learned since about that connection?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I grew up around it. Growing up in a house where your mother was a healthcare leader. We would be going into the hospital late at night. We'd be getting the phone calls. I know there's other nurses out there whose parents, mothers and fathers are leaders, and they watch their parents get those phone calls late at night. We don't have enough staff. We're calling people in, or you're one of those staff members getting called in on weekends, even though it's your third, fourth, fifth shift. And you see that, and it hasn't changed in decades. And so seeing all of that and knowing, what it does to the staff, but then also seeing the side where we care so much about our profession. I always remember dragging the crock pots into the staff lounge and making the buffets for the staff, and not just on Nursing Appreciation Week, but, taking care of your staff and seeing the community and the family around nursing. But understanding kind of both sides of the equation, this profession that we love so much and we're so caring, but also that we're burning out from. So when I went into my doctoral program and I was studying our workforce, so I was in health services research, health systems was my major, workforce was my minor, and how we can influence those patient outcomes. I was really looking at issues that were plaguing our profession. And there was no bigger wicked problem to our profession at the time than burnout. And my dissertation was actually around failure to rescue. So things that happen as a result of burnout. So understanding that connection, that burnout's not just something that happens to us and we kind of have to deal with it. It has real consequences. So as I finished my dissertation and I went into my postdoctoral fellowship and then started my career in this research profession, it kind of seems like we've been dealing with this problem for a while, but in reality, we are making strides in understanding it. I often talk to people who say, oh, I know burnout, I was dealing with this in the 60s and 70s and 80s, but we have to remember that back then, we really were blaming individuals for their burnout. We were saying, go home, you get better, and you come back. But what we do know now is that burnout is an occupational phenomenon. Our decades of research on the backs of these researchers who have learned so much have really taught us that burnout comes from our work environment. And once we know that, we know it's fruitless to send these individuals home, right? They're just going to keep coming back into these environments where they're going to get burned out again. And so it might not seem like that big of a deal that we're understanding these work environments and these systems issues, but we are starting to make a difference in pulling all this research together and understanding it. And so much so that it was really just recently in 2019 that the World Health Organization reclassified burnout from an individual medical diagnosis to an occupational phenomenon. And so that small little shift told organizations, told healthcare systems, this is now your problem. You need to address this and help your employees deal with burnout. It's not your employees' problem to go home and get better. You need to be addressing the systemic issues that deal with burnout.
Well, I love how you've outlined that and sort of this evolution of our understanding of burnout. And, I have to say, Leslie, one of the choices that you made in your career was you stayed a nurse researcher connected to the clinical side and connected to clinical practice. And so your ability to see the reality of what nurses were going through even prior to the pandemic. And I think your deep understanding of burnout and this concept of resilience, I'm going to put that in quotes for a minute, and understanding all of that prior to the pandemic, right? When all of the sort of stressors of what we were going through, both as a society and as nurses, really came to fruition. And this lens was there around burnout and resilience. And I keep putting resilience in quote because I know even at the height of the pandemic, one of the things that you really did so masterfully was summarize our understanding of burnout and the research to date and share that with our nursing colleagues. What I'm curious about is with what you learned about burnout and resilience before the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, tell us a little bit about your lens on all of this today.
Yeah, it's been a journey for sure. I mean, so prior to the pandemic, which, I think we're all still processing that, we were really starting to see the understanding of burnout. I remember distinctly, in October of 2019, after the World Health Organization had made their proclamation in May, and then the National Academy of Medicine had put together an action collaborative around improving well-being, and they had put out a big report that was produced in October, because it was right around my daughter's birthday, and they had a big well-being day in Washington, D.C., and they put out this report, and there were all these action initiatives for healthcare organizations to start improving, the lives of healthcare workers. And we were very geared up. And then, less than 6 months later, in February of 2020, we all know what happened. And, the whole world pivoted to dealing with the pandemic and basically putting out fires. So the burnout issue, basically shifted into, crisis of burnout. But prior to that, when we talk about resilience, I think it was hard for our profession to understand how to process and understand resilience. And it got misconstrued for sure. And it even got a bad name, to the point to where, it became the bad R word, right? And I think, and I give you a lot of credit, Marla, because you and I would have long conversations about this, about how, people are speaking about resilience the wrong way, and how can we support this? And we have to remember the term resilience comes from our trauma literature, right? And adverse childhood events, and understanding resilience comes from adversity. You have to have adversity, and that's how you build resilience. So resilience, everyone has some in us, right? It's innate. You might have a little, you might have a lot, but everybody has a little. But what we know is,
I would just say, to get to be a nurse, you need to have more than the average person.
we won't talk about the nursing school process for resilience. But what we've learned about resilience through all of this research about ACEs and about other types of activities is that you can get more, you can learn it. And maybe where it took a wrong turn is we jumped on that wagon too much, right? We wanted everybody just to get more resilience, do these resilience building activities. And we threw that intervention at everyone for everything. And, maybe the work environment's not so good, get some more resilience. Or maybe you're in a bullying situation, get some more resilience. And I'm being a little crass here, but the idea is a resilience building exercise or a resilience training, or just, going home and doing some mindfulness is not going to fix every problem. And there was a point there where we used it as an opportunity to say, this is going to help everything. And we didn't necessarily address those systemic issues, especially when we were dealing with the crisis of COVID. But I think it went a little too far, and we forgot that we do need resilience building for some of the things that we do deal with in this profession. So we cannot forget that because we are nurses, because we deal with the sick, the vulnerable, the trauma, the people when they are suffering, and we are exposed to that same suffering. And even as leaders, as we work with our staff to go through all of this, we are always going to be at risk for this secondary traumatic stress. And that's not going to go away. We are in this profession, and we chose this profession. We have passion for this profession. And so we need to mitigate that secondary traumatic stress. And so we must have resilience for that, or we will burn out very quick, and we will be out of here so fast. But like you said, we're nurses. We came into this, and we have resilience coming into this. And so we must practice those resilience building exercises. And so this is where I get a little preachy, and I say, you must, build up your resilience. You must have that mindfulness. You cannot have poor coping mechanisms. You cannot, say I'm fine with the fire burning around you and pretend like everything's okay, because you will burn out, and we need you. We need you to not burn out. We need you in this profession. And so, I can't let resilience have a bad name. I have to say that, the resilience building activities are necessary.
Mhm. As I listen to you, I think about the concept of post-traumatic growth, right? Everyone's familiar with post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress disorder, but there's an equally important concept called post-traumatic growth. And you've alluded to that, right? You need to have some adversity to build your resilience. Often when people go through a really difficult traumatic time, they grow from that. And I'm curious about how you see that our profession and our organizations have grown in our practice, our understanding, our contribution to patient care through this experience that we've shared as the pandemic.
Yeah, I do. I mean, as I mentioned, I do think we're still processing. I do think one of the things that happened is we lost a lot, right? We had a lot of people leave. So I don't think we were as quick on the uptake to be there and ready for the processing, for the healing. We talked about this as well, that, there was a healing that needed to take place, and it would have been impossible, right? One of the things we talk about is that people need time, but we can't let everyone in our profession step away for time, right? So some of the things that are known factors for how you process and you heal from trauma just can't happen when you're in the workforce and you're doing these activities. And so having the autonomy and the flexibility to build, I think, is something that we're going to have to learn, because certainly we will go through maybe not something as big as this in our lifetime, but we do continue to have these stressful events, the tornadoes, the hurricanes, the EHR changeovers. There's all kinds of things that we need resilience for, right? That really rock how we care for patients. And so I do think that what we are beginning to learn is that there are things that are more effective and things that are less effective. And what we're willing to be flexible to do in healthcare is certainly something that we need to adapt for, because what we've been a little less adaptive to is that flexibility. We haven't been able to say, let's try this and see how it works, right? One of the things I loved about COVID was our flexibility, right? Let's see how it works, letting these people go to 4-day work weeks, or doing this remotely, or flexing people to a different department. That didn't work, let's switch again. And so having some of that flexibility, certainly to see not only how it affected care, but how it affected well-being.
So Leslie, you have such an interesting perspective, because you're in the clinical practice arena, yet you're kind of on the balcony, right? You're sort of or on the sidelines, right? Looking and watching all of this. And so my next question for you is, when you think about what we've learned, what advice would you give to a nurse leader about what skill building they need to do as an individual, and how they can work with their teams to strengthen their sort of collective team well-being?
Oh, goodness. Like any good researcher and leader, I'd say, let's have a conversation about it. I don't need to be giving you advice. I learned so much from these leaders. I do speak with our leaders about well-being. And like I said, I learned from them so much. One of the things that, we can't just talk about is, role modeling. Role modeling is really hard. But one of the things we talk about is a culture shift. For too long, we've been the hardy profession, the one that says, we can muscle through, we can, not cry, we can, be the one that shows no weakness. Sometimes it's a stigma. And so talking about, and I know I lose people sometimes here, but kind of our framework or our theoretical background of why it's important to have this holistic perspective of well-being, and why we need all aspects of showing our vulnerability. sometimes helps them open up. There will always be the staff members that never want to see you walk out at 4:45 p.m. with a yoga mat under your arm. But what we're hopefully shifting to is that they want to see a leader that is role modeling well-being behavior for them. They want to see a leader that can speak holistically about their whole life. And it's very hard when, there's other issues going on, if there are work environment issues. So this always comes back to, again, addressing those systemic problems, which is two sides of the coin. But the leaders often sometimes are afraid to show those other sides of, role modeling their well-being, or they're not practicing their own well-being, because it is the world's hardest job to be a nurse manager. And often, meaningful recognition comes into play, and they're having a hard time with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate this, starting with role modeling and even being articulate to people about, I am leaving today at 4:45 to go to yoga. This is what I'm doing for my own well-being. And really making that a declaration, right? I mean, if people started that habit, it begins to shift the assumptions around what well-being is in the workplace.
Well, and ultimately, doesn't it come back to, and anyone in an organization will tell you this, is HR practices, right? You're backed by your HR practices and your leaders, and you have to be able to say to your employees, are you okay? Do you have this? Do you need to leave? And if a leader's afraid to say, I know you're not okay, but I don't have a space for you to leave, then it's not going to work. And so when we have that strong work environment, and we have the ability to stand someone up and ask them about their well-being, knowing that I can give them time off, I can give them time away. That's really the interconnectedness of that full framework, their work environment, their policies, their culture and their well-being, and that personal resilience.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. I love that. I love that. So you mentioned meaningful recognition, and I know you've done a lot of work on meaningful recognition. So talk to us a little bit about meaningful recognition.
Yeah, this is such a tough one, right? We talk about recognition in so many different ways, but one of the things we've learned is that meaningful recognition is part of a healthy work environment. Again, this is part of a framework. The AACN, the American Association of Critical Care Nurses, has done a lot of work in this area. And then myself and others have put out research to really validate and say that those that have been meaningfully recognized have positive outcomes, and then those positive outcomes translate to good work environments and good patient outcomes, and to staying in your position, because ultimately we want to stay in our job and we want to do good work. But what does meaningful recognition mean? And so, there are tenets to this that have been studied. It's obviously not a pizza party. We will get that out of the way. But what we understand is that meaningful recognition is meaningful to the person. And what is very hard for a leader is that your employees, your nurses, all feel recognized differently. So, your nurse that likes to be verbally recognized in front of everyone in the unit, being told a job well done, might be very different from your nurse who that would absolutely terrorize, and wants a handwritten note maybe sent to their house. And so once again, the nurse manager role is one of the hardest roles ever, because it's about understanding your nurses and understanding yourself, because as a leader, you also need to understand your own recognition practices, and then how you can recognize others. There's some great literature in this area that talks about that, and kind of compares it to the 5 love languages, the 5 languages of appreciation, and kind of makes that analogy for understanding that. We also use the DAISY Award as an example of how we really show recognition, because what it does is patients, family members, other employees, leaders, anyone's able to write a nomination to show those awards, or to show those meaningful words of recognition. And then what they do is make sure that it's awarded to the person in some form of meaningful recognition. So they use a pen on the badge. They often chose to read it in a way to the employee, or give the award to the employee to make sure that they have those awards given to them. So little practices that can make the act and make the process meaningful to show that you have been recognized for the work that you do. So it's about thinking about the process, thinking about the actions and the outcomes. And we've done research on that to show that when you include those different actions and components, that people feel more recognized, less burned out, and have more appreciation.
Mhm. Yeah, I often think too that some of what is happening in healthcare, and when we talk about nurse leaders, there is this assumption that the leader is the manager. And part of the opportunity that people have is to be a leader in their clinical team. Because as you know, often meaningful recognition means more when it comes from a colleague who is working with you or following you or taking a handoff from a patient. And, I think people taking that moment, right? It's moments of recognition to really acknowledge the work that their colleagues are doing, and particularly something that ends up being outstanding. I mean, you and I have, and I think every nurse has had the experience of handing off a patient at the end of one shift to a nurse, walking in the next morning and taking report from that same nurse. And there's nothing more meaningful than to have a nurse say something about the condition of the patient or the handoff and appreciating what you left, right? And really acknowledging the work that you did, or someone pitching in and helping out, and you're noticing that. I often say to people that, appreciation, honest given appreciation can make or change your shift.
Absolutely.
And, those are the moments.
Absolutely. The influential leadership is probably something we under practice quite often.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about the skills that we want to develop, particularly in a newly graduated nurse, to be able to have this holistic practice, to build their resilience, to recognize when they're getting burnout and take care of themselves, to create a culture of meaningful recognition. What advice would you give to nurse leaders about how to guide their younger colleagues in building those competencies?
Right? Isn't this a great area for growth? And I do feel some hope for our profession. And when we talk about the future here and we talk about areas where we are really growing and what has come out of the pandemic and what has come out of our workforce challenges, I do think this is where we are shining a light in nursing. We've all been talking about our 1-year retention rates and our 3-year retention rates. And while we're looking at it in this aspect, we're also saying, what can we do for this area, this group, whether it's even starting when they're in school or starting when they're newly graduates, and keeping our eye on them for those first 1, 2, 3, 5 years. And I see so much opportunity and hope for what's happening there. Residency programs, cohort learning, things that are building in well-being practices, building in new technologies, building in teamwork and collaboration. So I don't know if I have the best answers. I know, practices that we're doing where I'm working, practices that are happening in, places that I'm collaborating with and talking to and working through associations that I work with. But I would say key tenets is that they are doing things that we have not done in decades, right? They are building in well-being. They are slowing down, their burst of learning at the beginning and giving them time to breathe, and letting them learn at a pace. They are understanding the need to build out the technology and not resist against it. So I hope that this is putting in place the practices that we need to retain our profession, because I don't know if it was you or another colleague that was saying, we are feeding this pipeline in, but they are coming out just as fast.
Yeah.
And it's really, that is going to be one of our biggest challenges with the future. And obviously we will have to address staffing, we will have to address models of care, but back to the framework, there are so many aspects of this that make our nurses holistic, that make them come into this profession, and 3-4 short years later, they're saying, no, thank you, and I want out of it. And I think we can do more than just our staffing and our models of care to make them still say, I love nursing and I want to be here and I want to be here for the patients.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's something so powerful about being a nurse. And we see so many people enter nursing as a second career, largely, even though they know it's going to be hard, largely because they know they can make a meaningful difference in the world. And bottom line, when people come to work, that's what they want to be able to do. They want to be able to walk in, make a meaningful difference, and walk out at the end of the shift and feel good about the work that they did. And that's the practice, right? That's the practice that we're trying to create.
Absolutely.
So Leslie, as we finish up here, I'm curious about if there's anything else that you've been thinking about as we've been talking that you want to share with the group.
Oh goodness. I think the future belongs to all of us. There's so many ideas, and I think that we have the opportunity to put them into practice. My passion, obviously, is research. So I think that that's a great path forward. But I think we often forget that there's other paths too, right? So I love it when someone comes to me and says, I have a research idea. And I think that if you have a researcher or someone in your unit or educator or facility or leader, someone to say that to, that's amazing. But don't often forget that we could do that with, a process improvement idea or an EVP idea. And that everything just starts with, I have an idea. Those are my favorite words. So even if something's not a research study, that is just the absolute best way to start someone, because that is how we improve. That is how we improve our profession. That is how we improve our care. It's how we improve everything around us. And so when, there's people like me and you and educators and leaders in our field working to kind of pick our eyes up and say, okay, what can we turn this into? That's how we're going to keep moving forward. So I think keeping the eyes open, saying, I have an idea, and it might be one that works this time and it might not. And the next time it might turn into 5 great ideas. But always keeping our eyes open for what we could do better, what we might try, what we saw at another facility or at a conference or read in an article. It's all of that spirit of inquiry that I think just keeps us fresh.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, one of the things that we learned about ourselves at the height of the pandemic was how flexible and adaptable we could be, how rapidly we could move. And there's a myth in healthcare, in nursing, that we need to move slowly. And we learned that we don't, right? And so, certainly we needed to legitimately catch our breath. We needed to legitimately heal. We need to regroup. But part of this is, what did we learn that we could carry forward as part of our growth, right? In the spirit of growth and learning as part of our practice. And that's really what you're articulating, is how do we grab that flexibility? How do we grab onto that? I have this idea and it may not work, but it may, and test it out. Well, that's a great place for us to end. Thank you, Leslie, so much for joining us today and sharing all of your expertise and wisdom.
Always fun to talk to you, Marla. Thank you.